Welcome to the Dr. Todd Talks Tune Show, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Todd Samra, and we, of course, have another very exciting episode for you today on our show that is entitled Almost Still Famous. I was going to call it Almost Famous, but I'm pretty sure there's a copyright on that title. So, Almost Still Famous. These people at one point in time were very famous. They were very known by their peers, and some even by the general public, and were considered to be somewhat famous people. Now, of course, these people are still famous within certain groups, like musicologists. Professional musicians know who they are, but they're not necessarily household names or people that are still famous today. We're going to start with Guillaume Dufay. Guillaume Dufay lived from about 1400 to 1474. So a very famous 15th century composer, highly regarded in his day, and really responsible for, if you will, creating music in a more modern way than was done in medieval times. One of the things that he did is he made all of the voice parts equal to each other. So if you listen to music from the previous century, another famous Guillaume de Machaut, his music is hierarchical. In other words, the lower voices are slower and the higher voices move more quickly, where Dufay kind of made them all equal to one another. They're just higher and lower. He was French, and his most famous work is called Nuper, rosarum, flores. And Nuper, rosarum, flores was dedicated for the completion of the cathedral in Florence. And if you've been to Florence, this is a famous landmark. And it has a very famous dome that was finished by a man named Brunelleschi. And basically the problem is the gap in the roof was too large to build a dome that wouldn't collapse. And so they had a lot of trouble with rain and weather getting in. And finally someone solved the problem, and his name was Brunelleschi. Of course, what he did is he built a dome within a dome so that it was reinforced and strong enough to not fall in on itself. So it's kind of famous. And what Dufay did with this work is really quite cool. He used the proportions of the cathedral in the proportions of the music. So this whole idea of music and architecture being handmaidens really goes all the way back to Dufay. I want to play a little bit of it just so you hear what it sounds like. This is Nuper, rosarum, flores. So to our ears, it sounds ancient. It sounds dated. There are no instruments, of course. This is all just vocal music. Of course, there's some debate on that regarding the a cappella tradition. And, you know, if your town didn't have any altos, but you had a viola player, you can still have the viola player play the alto part, and it's still considered a cappella, even though there's an instrument accompanying. So be very careful with that definition. He wrote a lot of different types of music. In other words, he wrote secular music and sacred music both. He wrote motets, masses, and chansons. His music usually has 4 or 5 parts, or 4 or 5 voices, and there's a lot of paired voicing, which of course is going to influence later the great composer Josquin des Prez, who's going to use a lot of paired voicing technique in his music. He had international fame. His music appeared in over 70 manuscripts from many different countries, from Italian countries, French countries, and so we see his name all over the place. So we know that he was a significant composer based on his number of appearances, but also on his influence on composers of the next generation. Next up, we have Charles Villiers Stanford, and he's one of my favorite composers. He's a personal favorite of mine, and he lived from, of course, 1854 to 1924. He was Irish by birth, but is mostly known for writing Anglican church music. He was a professor at Trinity College, Cambridge, and he helped form the Royal College of Music as it exists today. Part of his influence was as a teacher. He was a teacher to Elgar and to Holst, and to Vaughan Williams. And so we really see his imprint, especially in the tradition of writing Anglican choral music, or just choral music, if you just want to limit it to that. Definitely in the work of Holst and Vaughan Williams in particular, but also Elgar, who wrote some choral music also. Stanford was part of something known as the Tractarian movement, or the Oxford movement, or at least that movement was highly influential on him and on his music. And what it was kind of a return to the aesthetics of the Renaissance, moving maybe away from Romanticism and finding a style that was unique to Anglican church music. And of course, what these liturgical people did in the Tractarian/Oxford movement was they looked back to earlier traditions and kind of brought them back, in much the same way that Mustangs and Camaros nowadays resemble their original designs from the 1960s. It's kind of bringing those elements back and making them kind of stylish in a modern way. So they were using modern harmonies, but writing with a clarity and in some ways imitating the style of Renaissance music. I think his music is particularly beautiful. As a matter of fact, what we heard at the very beginning of the show was one of his pieces called "The Bluebird," which is a lovely piece. It's about death. As a matter of fact, this episode is dedicated to my Aunt Linda, who just recently passed away, and the piece makes me think of her right now. But it's a piece very closely associated with death. It's a secular work, but a very interesting, very, very beautiful and romantic work that does show off some of this kind of clarity of the Renaissance, even though it's really 4 parts against 1. The top soprano part has most of the action. So I'm going to replay that little section, and we're going to listen to an example from "The Bluebird." Here's the soprano. Everybody else. Of course, it's going to build here. A bird. There flew a bird. So this example is one of my personal favorites, but doesn't really demonstrate that technique that I was talking about returning to a Renaissance style. So we're going to listen to another example that he wrote called "Beati quorum via." And here we have 6 parts: soprano 1, soprano 2, alto, tenor, baritone, and bass. And here they're going to come in order. Here begins the bass. Bass and baritone, actually. Here's the tenor. Here's the alto. Soprano 2. Soprano 1. Pairs. We see this style of writing really in some of Elgar's music and Holst's music and Vaughan Williams' music. They're using these choral textures in much the same way, that Stanford did. So I think a very important composer, especially in the history of English music, even though he is Irish, but one that maybe should be more well known today, who simply isn't. In the history of music history, there is a definite lack of representation by female composers. And of course, this is because women for so many centuries were suppressed. But we start to see that change more and more throughout the 19th century. And there is an important American composer that is on my list today. And that, of course, is Amy Cheney Beach. And she lived from 1867 to 1944. She was the first American composer, first female American composer to have a major work performed by her major orchestra. She was the first American composer to be successful without prior training in Europe. That's a very curious situation to be in. She married a surgeon, Dr. H.H.A. Beach, And so when you look her up, make sure that you look her up by Mrs. H.H.A. Beach, because that's how she's listed in many of her publications. By the way, when they married, he was 42 and she was 18. This, of course, curtailed her performing career quite a bit because she had to be wife first. She did publish over 300 works, including symphonies, a concerto, chamber works, and many art songs. Her style was influenced by the music of Brahms, but also by American composers Horatio Parker and Ed MacDowell. Lastly on our list, and maybe most interesting on our list, is Louis Moreau Gottschalk. Louis Moreau Gottschalk was born in 1829 and lived until 1869. He was born in Nolens, was a prolific composer and pianist, and should be more famous in America today. He, of course, fled the United States for South America. He ended up dying in Rio. It's kind of an interesting story. He was accused of statutory rape in San Francisco, so he fled the U.S., went to South America, was bit by a giant spider, and died. He had toured Europe, so he had some fame as an American composer traveling throughout Europe, in particular in France. He was considered the best pianist of his age from the New World, which is quite a compliment to be given in Europe. He was strongly influenced by his Creole upbringing, his heritage. He freed his own slaves upon his father's death. He began studying piano and violin at age 4, so somewhat of a musical prodigy, and in 1841 he was sent away to Paris to study. While there, he played for Chopin, for Berlioz, and made a trip to Spain to play for Queen Isabella. He wrote a symphony for 10 pianos. Quite interesting, 10 completely different pianos on the stage at the same time. And he put together these things called monster concerts that included all kinds of well-known tunes, Spanish tunes and American tunes both. For example, Bunker Hill is one of these examples of how he mishmashed a whole bunch of different things into one example. To play an example of his music, I want to play a little bit of the Souvenir de Puerto Rico. It's really a set of theme and variations. It's spicy in kind of a Creole sort of way. I'm going to move to the next. So we can hear a little chromaticism in there, much like Chopin, but definitely not Chopin. A flavor and spice kind of unique unto itself. So I think a tremendous composer that really deserves a lot more credit and fame than he actually possesses today. So that's what this episode is really about. It's about bringing maybe a little more attention to 4 people who were famous once upon a time and maybe are famous within certain circles, but maybe deserve a little more attention and fame today than maybe they currently have. It's hard to compete with the Kardashians. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today on Dr. Todd Talks Tunes. Please subscribe to our channel and tune in again next week. Thank you, and see you all soon.